outcomes relevant to public stakeholders in Nairobi, including on possible ways forward, obviously, as that's what they really relate to. So, Joe, please.
Well, thanks, Ricardo. Thanks very much to the WTO and ICTSD and for co-hosting this conference with us. And I really appreciate everyone being here rather than being on the Paki Plage or out on some terrace somewhere enjoying the weather. So I'll try to be brief. I think, out of Nairobi, of course, members reaffirmed their to negotiate a permanent solution for public stockholding. They reaffirmed the peace clause that had been negotiated in Bali. Yet, frankly, since Bali, very little progress has been made. And as was mentioned in the introduction, since Bali, prices have fallen a great deal, and you can see that on this chart from those highs that we saw in 2012 and 2013 now have fallen about 50% since then. And I think what we saw as the prices began to run up in the early 2000s, 2005 forward in particular, as prices started to spike, what you saw in many countries that had food security reserves that were operating those with administered prices, they raised prices, trying to follow those price levels. And unfortunately, as prices have started to come down, then some of those prices have remained quite high relative to market prices, which have resulted, at least in some countries, with massive stock accumulations. And I think that's also obviously prompted concerns, but also both within and without. Both within the country and outside those countries. We've seen reforms, recent reforms for cotton policies and maize policies in China, and I think that again, acknowledgement that maintaining those very large inventories, that those need to be worked off some way that doesn't disrupt world markets. Well, what's the issue? And I think that obviously, for those of you who have followed this very closely, yes, in the Agreement on Agriculture, the Green Box allows for public stockholding for food security purposes. That's largely contained in Annex 2, Paragraph 3. And there, however, there's a caveat that essentially says, but if those prices or if those purchases are made on administered prices, then countries need to at least calculate the implicit support levels and report those to the WTO under the WTO rules, more general rules on accounting for domestic support. And there it's essentially the administered support minus a fixed external reference price times eligible production. And for most members who at least came in in 1994, 1995 with the WTO. That base period is 1986, 1988. And there you can see that at least under that average price, at least for about the first 10 years or so of that agreement, those average prices didn't move that much. In fact, they came down fairly close by the early 2000s to that 86, 88 level. And so we didn't see much problems really develop until mid-2000, 2006, 2007. I remember I was as was mentioned, I was a negotiator at the time, and I can remember, I think one of the last meetings we had in 2008, group meetings that is, was in this very room on public stockholding or on paragraph 3, and talked a lot about that, and there was a lot of back and forth between delegations on how best to move forward on that. But it's just to say that with those high prices, countries started if they were maintaining price levels very low, close to that 86, 88 average, with those price levels starting to go up, many countries felt that they needed to raise prices, their support prices in kind, and move them up again to provide some support. And then the problem, of course, is what's happened since with when prices have begun to fall. Well, again, In my paper, I lay out a number of alternatives. I might say at the outset, I don't think there's a magic bullet here, unfortunately, that there are some very difficult issues to try to work on this thing. Obviously, where price appreciation has occurred because of currency fluctuations, and in some countries, they, unfortunately, if their currency has appreciated a lot relative to other currencies in the world, then they may be facing those prices, if they're calculating their AMS support in their local currency, then they may be facing this. Now, some countries have gotten around this in one sense by changing the way they report. I think India is a good example where they began reporting in U.S. dollars. And I think that this is something that it seems to me to be a fairly reasonable accommodation in one sense, that is to report in a more stable currency. Now, obviously, that means reporting base periods, et cetera, and kind of making that calculation. But I think that that's a reasonable adjustment. But unfortunately, that's, for many countries, that's not enough, that there's still a problem that when they calculate the implied support by taking the administrated price minus the fixed external reference price and multiplying times the eligible production, that puts them either near their de minimis levels or above their de minimis levels, and which is, of course, highly problematic if that country doesn't have a bound AMS to begin with. So the other potential solution that you hear people talk about is, well, why not just increase the de minimis percentages and move them higher than 10%? I think that's a far more systemic issue, that's is far more problematic because support may be more than just stock holding, that for some commodities you may have other potential problems. I mean, you may have other potential support going to that commodity, things like insurance subsidies or other things. And so that raises a pretty big, I think, perhaps provides too much additional support that could be given to commodities, and I think a number of countries have at least been on record as opposing that. The other issue, another alternative has been to update the base period, and the 86, 88 prices you can see there are quite low relative to what we've seen. Again, not over the first 10 years, but certainly over the last 10 years, we've seen much higher prices. And indeed, countries that have more recently acceded members to the WTO have been allowed to have an updated base period. If I'm not mistaken, China has their base period is 1996 to 1998. Russia, which was, of course, just recently acceded, is 2006 to 2008. The problem, though, about revising a base period is that not only does one need to revise the base period, not just for the fixed eternal reference price, but also for the one would need to do that to recalculate the original AMS levels. If one notified or bound an AMS level, that would all have to be negotiated. And as you can see, that also has the potential for grossly underestimating support levels if prices fall. So I think there's concerns there, and many people have raised issues about that. Another issue, another potential solution would be to index the fixed reference price and not just hold it. Maybe if one could look at the fixed reference price as say a moving average of the last 3 years or a moving average of 5 years, throwing out the high-low. And I do have some examples of that. Here I've essentially taken a world wheat price, and I here as a proxy use the U.S. price for hard red winter wheat. And there I calculated the 1986 to 88 base. And then there I put in a 3-year moving average. And you can see that, yes, the 3-year moving average actually follows prices pretty well, as you might expect. But it does have the uncomfortable problem of sometimes going way above market prices. And there, as you can, if you could imagine setting a support price at the moving average, that you could see that sometimes you would have a support price that would be very, very much higher than the world market price. It would provide a large potential incentive for production, yet for AMS purposes, if indeed we were allowing the fixed external reference price to move with a 3-year moving average, it would have resulted in a zero AMS for that year, yet actually provide a lot of support. And again, that's true for almost any of these that you find. You can find some period where you would be in excess and largely, and you can see, particularly with the recent price drop over the last 2 or 3 years, we've seen a large price drop, and that would be if you were to set price supports relative to a 5-year Olympic average or a 3-year moving average, you would have price supports well above market prices. And I think that that's a potential distortion that, again, that many people are concerned about. Another alternative, I might add, would be to index it to, say, a cost of production index, or maybe a more general price index. You often see world prices deflated by the consumer price index of the U.S. or sometimes by the World Bank's manufacturing unit value index. Those are all relative. Those all would allow some movement and upward movement in prices, and presumably try to map overall policies or overall price movements. But again, I would caution there that remember that agricultural prices, because of the vast productivity gains that we've seen in agriculture, agricultural prices have declined relative to other prices in the economy over the last 60 years. And so indeed, one may, if one were using the other prices to somehow as a proxy for some index to adjust these prices, one could end up, if one had done that over the last 60 years, you'd have very, very high support prices relative to the nominal prices that we see in agriculture, largely because of the productivity gains. Well, the other obvious ones are things that many of my colleagues have mentioned. One, restricting eligible production. Of course, the Korea beef case, where the panel, in looking at that, or appellate body, if I'm not mistaken, looked at that and said, well, if a country were to announce that was only supporting X amount, that would work, or that you could use that production rather than all production in the calculation. I might add, from an economist perspective, that probably doesn't make as much sense as it might make for a legal decision, just in the sense of supporting some portion of production, depending on how one does it. If it's taking that off the market, then that obviously can have implications for all production. But I think that, at least from a legal perspective, it is something that is a potential way of addressing that issue. The other thing that's been mentioned by my colleague Eugenio is to set administrative prices below market prices. And so the idea there that one could, this of course would require a change, but if one were allow that, if you were to set prices below where the market prices currently are, that would at least be less distorting. I think the issue there is how much below, and we know that prices, support prices, can create floors for producers, and even when they are lower than market prices, just because they do, producers know that they can't fall below that price without the government taking some action. Now, again, you know, for mostly what we're talking about, I think that when most people talk about public stock holding, is talked about in a food security sense. And I think that you know, certainly with the price run up in 2007-8, we see the people understand why these food security systems are put in place. What one wants to prevent, however, is from those same policies having an adverse effect, or maybe even an unintended effect of increasing production, because they're providing distortions. And I think that's really the challenge here. Well, the last two I would mention, I think are pretty simple, and again, I'll lay these out in more detail, but one would be just to exempt LDCs from from a number of countries, particularly African countries, operate food reserves. And I think that isn't necessarily what people are concerned about so much. And then the last one I think is probably the most obvious in one sense, and that's to make the interim solution a more permanent one, that is, extend to developing countries, all developing countries, but again require reporting and allow again where these policies would still be vulnerable to challenge through the subsidies and countervailing measure code of the agreement or the WTO. There, I think that you're in the land of saying, well, I hearken back to what Crawford Faulkner said here, I guess last fall or so, where that was alluded to by Ricardo, that in the essay talked about how to build confidence with this. And I think that in an interim solution, one could certainly, as we see how these things are operated, one has a better notion of what countries are doing, and I think that too could certainly provide confidence to the system and hopefully lead to a longer-term solution there. So with that, let me conclude.
Thank you very much, Joe. That gives really an excellent, again, contextualization of what is really relevant going forward. And as you say, maybe already with the declining prices and the rising inventories, and there may be countries that are already rethinking their own schemes. So again, we'll see where we are when we get to, say, MC11. But let me just, with that, turn to Raul and ask Raul to talk about the outcomes on SSM, on the special safeguard mechanism, and the possibilities to go forward, which is what that decision talks about. Raul.
Okay, thank you, and good afternoon. Well, first, thank you to ICTSD and IFPRI for inviting me to talk about SSM. But actually, when they called me up, I had several qualms about traveling all the way here from the Philippines to talk about SSM, knowing that there was a virtual stalemate on the issue before Nairobi, and knowing also that there was practically no movement on the issue again after Nairobi. So the question that went to my head was, is there anything new that I can contribute to the discussion, given the stalemate on the issue? So I will try to contribute something new. Hopefully it will not stir up a hornet's nest on the issue and make a resolution of the issue even much harder. So, but let me try to make my travel worth it. Okay, so what happened in Nairobi, basically two important outcomes, but there were only two important paragraphs anyway in the declaration. One was the affirmation of the right to have an SSM on the part of developing countries, and you could call this a victory or a plus for proponents of SSM, because from what I heard, there were also groups who were trying to kill SSM in Nairobi. And what happened was, instead of downplaying or killing SSM, the ministers affirmed the right of developing countries to an SSM, although this was already done in Hong Kong. So that was significant, I think. And then the other important conclusion from Nairobi was the provision to pursue negotiations in a dedicated session of the COA. Okay. So more focus in terms of negotiations on the SSM. And this has also probably something to do with the issue of linking SSM with market access negotiations in general. Personally, I feel that the negotiations on SSM have to be part of the overall market access negotiations, because for me, SSM is something like a confidence-building measure for developing countries as they pursue more market access reform. So, but the issue of linking or not linking, I think eventually it will be linked. No? But at least there is now more focused discussions on SSM in ACOA. But as I said, and most people feel, I think that the prospects for a deal remain very bleak. There's even a lack of consensus on the future of the DDA, as seen in the declaration in Nairobi. Very vociferous opposition to SSM still, and there are many disagreements on the futures of SSM. So that's the situation right now. I thought it would be a good idea to, when we discuss SSM, to try to look back on the experience with SSG in the Uruguay round. And in the UR, there were only 29 countries who had SSG privileges. You will recall that only countries that used to have import restrictions on their products were allowed to designate their products with SSG in exchange for tariffication. So these are the countries. And one thing you could highlight here was on a per country basis, the developed countries were actually the ones who had a lot of SSG designated products. Not in absolute numbers, but in terms of a per country basis. And okay. And this is now a compilation of data on SSG invocations done by the WTO sometime in 2000. I understand there's a new effort to update this data. Some insights from this table is, first, it was the developed countries who were invoking SSG more frequently than developing countries, so, almost double the rate. And secondly, the price-based SSG was more frequently used than the volume-based SSG. Okay. And I think that's very significant when I go to some of the new ideas that I'd like to propose later. By the way, this is very partial. They were only based on notifications received by the Secretariat at that time. So I know, for example, that the Philippines, my country, invoked SSG for chicken sometime in 2000, but it's not included in this table. So it might be good for the Secretariat to update this and see what really happened. This one is a breakdown of the previous table, but broken down by product categories on which product categories were normally the focus of SSG actions. And you can see that it was mainly on dairy, animals, and fruits and vegetables. Okay, so although we'll see later that there were many other opportunities for countries to use SSG, they actually used it in a very limited manner and focused on a few commodities. And usually these commodities are also the most distorted in terms of subsidies and other measures. I picked this up from a study made by an Australian research group. And they basically say the same story. More invocations by developed countries, more price-based than volume-based. And in terms of, we look at the last two columns, on the average, the countries covered by the study use their SSG privilege only 7% of the time that they could have used it. So they did it very sparingly, and I think it's only very logical for a country that's, for example, experiencing a shortage of the product not to use SSG even in the event of an import surge. So there was some form of, you could say, some evaluation of whether the import surge was actually harming or was a response to another thing. And so, although in some countries I noticed that they also have SSG system that is computerized. No? So it's automatic, no discussion. Once they breach the trigger, the SSG comes in automatically. But I think for most other countries, especially developing countries, they do not have that system. And they also have a system of trying to evaluate first before they apply SSG. This is a quote from, I pick it up from USTR statement about TPP. And for me, it was very enlightening, because here you have a big country, United States. I don't want to pick on the US, no? But you have a big country that is offering so much support already to its producers. But it still says that they need something that provides them with a rapid but temporary response through import relief, okay? Meaning safeguards, okay? To provide relief after a sharp and sudden increase in imports. And this was tires, not food, but tires. No? Apparently, in the accession agreement with China, the U.S. was able to secure a provision that allowed them to impose special safeguards on certain commodities. No? And from this statement, they're saying, yes, we need the safeguards. No? And we should be able to respond immediately to market disruptions like import surges for tires, okay? And if they can do, if a big developed country can seize the need for something like this for tires, even for producers who are already getting a lot of the support, then I would think that for a developing country that's very little resources to provide support to their producers, they also would need some kind of safeguard for their own producers, okay? So the point I wanted to raise here is that all countries need safeguards, no? Because they need a tool to address market emergencies, whether you're developed or developing. And this position of some countries to kill SSM or to say you don't need SSM, I think goes against what we see from the experience in the usage of SSG and from statements like this from the US. Okay, so this is just a summary of what I was saying about the trends in availment. Okay, so what is the problem about SSM? The one that I hear usually is that it will distort and disrupt international trade. If countries will abuse and use the safeguard measures consistently, then it will either kill trade or disrupt it very significantly. And by allowing them to apply SSM duties over and above their bound rates, then effectively you're allowing them to go around their MFN commitments. Okay, so those are the arguments I hear most of the time. On the other hand, for developing and least developed countries, they remain vulnerable to imports. In fact, even developed countries remain vulnerable. Maybe not now because prices are going up, but could happen in the future. Okay, and unlike developed countries, the developing countries do not have cannot afford to provide different types of safety nets to their producers. I was just reading this ICTSD paper on the U.S. Farm Bill. You have income insurance. If the price goes down or if your income goes down, then the insurance kicks in. It's like a safeguard also, okay? It protects their producers against price depressions, and it's done through a subsidy scheme. It's okay if that's what the government thinks it should do to help the producers. But developing countries do not have that kind of system. They cannot afford it. And the only way they can address price depressions or import surges is through a temporary increase in tariffs. That's the reality, I think, that we have to consider when we talk about SSM. But the current SSG has a very limited scope, only to those countries that were listed earlier. Difficult to access for many countries and has limited effectiveness, which I will explain later. And this is what I see happening now. When push comes to shove and the remedies that are allowable under WTO are not enough to address certain situations, the countries don't have second thoughts about using extreme measures, including de facto QRs or quantitative restrictions. No? They will do what needs to be done politically to survive. So better I think, for us to give them a more transparent, usable, but also predictable tool instead of forcing them into a corner where they will take extreme measures that will surely disrupt trade. No? So how can we sort out this problem now about SSM? Okay. 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 On volume SSM, the way the trigger is computed actually already provides for historical trade volumes to be preserved, right? Because you cannot impose the volume SSM until the cumulative amount of imports exceeds a certain level, which is the historical import level. You could add, and it's already done in the proposals now, some percentage for growth in trade. In SSG, they also inputted a growth that is based on consumption growth within the importing country. So in a way, when we talk about volume-based SSM, you are already protecting some form of historical trade volumes, okay? But the problem with volume SSM is that the remedy is imprecise. If you have, let's say, a 30% import surge, what is the tariff that will arrest that surge? Right now, it says so much percent or so much percentage points, but there is no formula or justification why it is like that. Is that remedy enough to address the import surge? I don't think anybody can say for sure. No. So it's very imprecise. It could be too much, it could be too little, depending on the situation. The other problem with the volume-based SSM and even SSG is that it doesn't take into consideration the bound tariff levels, okay, or applied. Okay. So the remedy is the same whether you have a high bound tariff or low bound tariff. And in a way that is not very fair, because a country with a high bound tariff already has a higher level of protection. So the question is, should you now allow that country the same remedy compared to a country that has very low bound tariffs? Okay. And then fourthly, the volume-based SSM is applied on an MFN basis. So once you breach that trigger, any country that exports to you gets hit by the SSM, even if he was just late in exporting to you. Okay, so those who export to you within the volume trigger, they go scot-free. They were the ones who led to the volume trigger being breached. But after it's breached, any other country that exports to you gets hit by SSM. Okay, a little bit unfair, I think. Okay. On the issue of price-based SSM, the problem with price-based SSM is it doesn't have anything to do about historical trade. Even the first import that comes in that already, where the price is already below the trigger, you can already apply price SSM, even if the historical volume has not yet been breached. Okay, but the advantage of SSM is it doesn't hit everybody. It only affects shipments, specific shipments, where the price is below the price trigger. So in a way, it's also, you could say, fairer. Okay, only the cheap and probably sometimes subsidized shipments will get hit by price SSM. Okay, but there is, in the current proposal, you compare historical import prices against current import prices, and then you apply the remedy based on the difference. Okay, but this type of comparison does not actually show you the effect of the imports on domestic markets. It's just comparing imports against historical against current prices. And then again, does not consider applied or bound tariffs. Okay, so what is the new idea? I'm not an economist, I'm not a negotiator, so I'm maybe thinking very simplistically. Okay, so first is to settle the issue about the scope of SSM. I don't think developed countries need to have SSM for all their products. No? That's an overkill, I think. No? Even in the SSG, we can see the SSM is used sparingly, and it's used only for some key products. Okay, so I don't think we need to quarrel about limiting the use of SSM to a few products or a few tariff lines. Okay, but leave it up to the country to decide. Okay. So that's number one area where I think we can do some compromise. Okay. Number two is solve the issue about historical trade and not disrupting normal trade volumes, okay, by having a common volume trigger, okay? So you allow the use of SSM, whether price or volume based, okay, very important, only when the imports exceed the historical levels by a significant percentage, okay? What's that percentage? 10, 20, 30, then I think we can negotiate on that, okay? But the idea is before anybody applies SSM, you should allow normal trade plus growth to come in, okay? The problem only comes in when, what if before you hit that trigger level, the import price is very, very low, so as to really disrupt the domestic market. Then maybe there could be an exception there, that even before you hit the trigger level, if the import price reaches a certain level, then maybe you could apply some sort of remedy. But that's subject to discussion. Okay, then the counting or accumulation of the import volume starts at its implementation year. So let's forget to talk about reimposition, imposition periods, holiday periods, no more. No? Let's simplify it. Up to the end of the year, come January 1, start from zero again and see, allow the historical imports to come in. And then the issue of FTAs, very tricky. I understand it's one of the hot issues now. But for me, whether the import comes from an FTA country or not is the same. The effect on the domestic market is the same. In fact, for FTAs, it might be worse because they're coming in at cheaper tariffs. Okay, but if I think within an FTA, countries will agree to less restrictive SSM, then they could do that within the FTA. But in the WTO, let's have like a omnibus agreement of an SSM mechanism that applies to everybody on an MFN basis. Okay, and then let the individual FTAs work out their own specific SSM adjustments. I think that would be simpler and fairer for everybody. Okay. When there is a, this is my last slide, by the way. When there is a, after you allow normal trade to come in, you either have further imports coming in, so more volume surge, or you can have price depression. But for me, the effect of imports, of excessive imports, is always reflected in terms of prices going down and affecting domestic markets. So what I'm trying to say here is the remedy should be price-based, but the trigger is volume-based. Only one, no more price, no more volume SSM. One volume trigger, one price remedy, okay? So that it will be much simpler because, again, the volume SSM remedy is very imprecise. But actually, when you have a volume surge, the effect of that is to flood the market with imports, and that is reflected in domestic prices going down. Okay, so your remedy must be something that relates to this price depression that is arising from the volume import surge. Okay, so one option is to retain the current formula, which is to compare average price of imports with current import price. You determine that difference, and the remedy will be a percentage of that difference. Okay, But I put in brackets here some type of formula where the remedy is inversely proportional to the level of MFN tariff. Okay, again, to sort of even out so that if you already have a high MFN, then maybe you don't need a very large remedy to resolve the situation. So something like that. But option one is not very precise. I think option two is more precise in terms of a remedy, but maybe more difficult to implement. Here you set your price figure to the average historical price of imports plus the MFN tariff. Okay, so you take into consideration how much level of protection you already have through your MFN tariff. And then you invoke that if your domestic price goes below that price level of the imports plus MFN. Not sure if this is workable, but some food for thought. And then, of course, you apply SSM duties only on shipment-by-shipment basis. No caps. No, I think the issue of limiting SSM duties to Doha bound rates, it's not logical. There is no remedy in the WTO rules, whether it's countervailing or regular safeguards. That's that. If a man is drowning and you throw him a life vest, okay, that life vest must be effective in helping that man survive. Otherwise, it's an inutile life vest. No? Yeah. So allow for growth to come in, but when the country is already drowning or gasping for breath, give him an effective remedy. No? So whatever it takes to solve that problem, I think. So I'd like to end there, and maybe we can, again, hopefully provoke some discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Raul, and not least for making all the way from Manila to be with us. Raul came in last night and is leaving tomorrow. So, I think you're making the proposal also at a good moment. The WTO members are in the process of organizing themselves and the discussion that should go towards the ministerial in 2017, and so I think that this is very good food for thought at a right moment. So again, thanks both Joe and Raul for those comments. Let's suggest that now we take about half an hour or so to go through some of these issues with comments from the floor. We will again suspend the webcasting for the moment. And I would actually, as I do this, I'd like to pass the chair to my colleague,